Hey guys, today I'll show you a supernatural horror TV series named Evil Season 2. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The second season picks up right where it left off last season. At the end of the last episode, the former forensic psychologist Kristen was in the bathroom holding a cross, which left a burn mark on her hand. After applying some medicine and packing up the cross, Kristen went to the trunk of her car and pulled out a blood-stained ice pick. She was preparing to bury it in the backyard when she looked up and saw her daughter standing in front of the window. She went to her daughter's room and found all her 4 daughters were sleeping soundly. Afterwards, Kristen went to the kitchen to clean the ice pick. Just then, she heard a sound. Kristen didn't take much notice, hung up the cleaned ice pick and dialed David's number, but no one answered. At this time, David, an intern priest, was trying to contact God through night running, but there was no response. He returned home and began to hurt himself in order to see God again. He then saw a vision of a wheat field and Kristen walking towards the horned demon for reasons unknown. However, the sudden weird appearance of the troublemaker Townsend brought him back to reality. Meanwhile, David's technical assistant Ben was at home and saw the news of the death of the serial killer Orson, who was accused of murdering 3 families but evaded punishment under the guise of being possessed. The next morning, David brought the promotional materials of the RSM Fertility to the bishop and told him that the scattered cases they had dealt with before were all related to children possessed by demons. Moreover, these children were all conceived artificially through the RSM Fertility, so they should conduct a thorough investigation. The bishop, who clearly didn't believe David, also asked the 2 people next to him. Kristen told the bishop that she had a daughter who was conceived artificially through that fertility, and if there was a problem, she would like to know the reason. When the bishop asked if the names of the children had been found, Ben told the bishop that the fertility's database had been cleared, and they were thinking about a plan B. The bishop told the 3 to put this matter on hold for the time being because he had an urgent case that required them to conduct an exorcism evaluation. This case was handed down by a cardinal. According to him, a wealthy man disclosed that he had voluntarily devoted himself to a demon when he was young, and now he wanted to apply for an exorcism. After coming out, Ben told Kristen that the serial killer was dead, and he saw blood on her leg yesterday and her hand is bandaged today. So he suspected his death was related to her. But Kristen told him that she was just fine, and asked him to help check what kind of metal this is, because she got a rash when she held it in her hand last night. Ben wanted to examine her palm injury, but Kristen refused him. At this time, the bishop brought the 3 to meet the wealthy man, who turned out to be Townsend. Townsend passionately told them that he fell in love with a woman and they were soon to be married. Kristen added that the woman was her mother. This news directly shocked everyone on the scene. Townsend continued that he had repented and wanted to undergo an exorcism. The group returned to the office and argued with the bishop. Everyone thought that Townsend was a troublemaker, but the bishop was determined to have everyone conduct an exorcism evaluation for Townsend. Kristen criticized him that their church people were all about money, especially that so-called cardinal, who had even become friends with Townsend. The bishop then told them that this was how things were going to be done. The group had no choice but to take the task. Subsequently, the 3 of them found Townsend. As soon as they met, Townsend told them it was love that had led him to decide on the exorcism. When Ben asked Townsend what he coveted, Townsend counter-questioned Ben about his recent sleep, asking if he had any nightmares. But David urged Townsend not to evade the questions. Townsend then told everyone that during his high school years, he was often bullied by the school bus driver. To retaliate, he used black magic and made a deal with a demon he summoned. He also described the demon to them, which coincidentally resembled the horned demon. After the evaluation, Kristen sought out her psychologist. Assured that the psychologist would not disclose patient confidentiality to the police, Kristen recounted the process of killing the serial killer Orson. The psychologist inquired about the real reason for her visit. Kristen immediately showed him her palm burned by the cross, wondering why. He told Kristen it was simple. It could be a rash symptom caused by PTSD and prescribed some medication for her. Arriving home with the medicine, Kristen saw blood on the floor. Following the trail of blood, she came to the bathroom door. Upon opening it, she found that it was a false alarm. The blood on the floor and the bloody handprints on the wall were caused by her daughter's bleeding tooth. Kristen promptly checked her daughter's toothache, confused by the shape of this tooth, which looked very much like a vampire's. Just as she was comforting her daughter that everything was okay, the doorbell rang. Ben, who had come to visit, told Kristen that the cross was made of cobalt, a metal that could cause a rash. This metal also has a high thermal conductivity, and it could cause burns with just a few degrees of heat. He came into the bathroom with Kristen and explained the bloodstains at the scene. Ben then discovered that the cause was a curling iron. The next day, the group met. Ben told David that the school driver from that year indeed died in a fire caused by a traffic accident, but he didn't find Townsend's name. Kristen said that she had investigated Townsend a few weeks ago, and at that time Townsend was called Jake Perry. She told the two that this was not some supernatural phenomenon. She believed that Townsend made up a story about having a conflict with the school driver after learning of his death. She had talked about this with his ex-wife before. If they didn't believe her, she could confirm it again. So David made her find Townsend's ex-wife and confirmed it, while he and Ben would meet him again. Later at Townsend's, he started his bluffs, but Ben ridiculed him for always talking about absurd things. Townsend told Ben that whether he believed it or not, he would have a dream tonight. But Ben dismissed his bullshit. Just then, Kristen came in and revealed the truth from his ex-wife that Townsend had his own car and never took the school bus home. Moreover, he didn't even know the driver. Seeing his lies exposed, Townsend admitted that he had lied. He then revealed the number behind his ear and said that the number was 9 last month, but now it has become 8. This must be Satan counting down his sins. Seeing Townsend acting like a drama queen, Kristen played along. David, who had been fooled once, said they needed to inspect his residence to see if there were any signs of demonic intrusion so as to confirm whether there was a demon. When Ben returned home and went to bed, he truly began to have nightmares. Much like Kristen, he dreamt of a demon. Just as the demon's hand penetrated his body, Ben was jolted awake by the nightmare. This experience scared the atheistic Ben quite a bit. Due to her daughter's dental issues, Kristen took her daughter to the dentist. After examining the x-rays, the dentist reassured Kristen, explaining that if a pregnant woman experienced fever symptoms, her child's teeth could grow in a certain way. However, it wasn't a big deal, and a minor surgery was scheduled for Thursday. After taking her daughter home, Kristen and the two arrived at Townsend's house. David said they only had 4 hours to conduct their investigation. Despite a thorough search, they found no signs of demonic intrusion. However, Kristen got a fright when she found a hidden doll in Townsend's wardrobe. Meanwhile, Ben, who cracked the computer password in the living room, called the two over. Hearing that Townsend mainly worked in the cloud, Kristen suggested that Ben install a surveillance software for real-time monitoring. He did so and began inspecting the room, following a sound to the wardrobe where he also encountered the doll. David, suspecting something amiss, removed the drawer and found a hidden compartment inside. As they pried it open, a foul smell wafted out. They found a piece of paper causing the scratching noise, the demon's hierarchy chart that Kristen's mother had secretly photographed. Some parts were marked with numeric symbols by Townsend. Choosing to avoid alarming Townsend, they put everything back as it was. As they were leaving, a cross on the door fell and hit Kristen on the head. Upon picking it up, they found another hidden item inside. The next day, Kristen and David confronted Townsend at his office. Kristen mocked him, saying they only found some tattoo tools, but no sign of demonic intrusion. She accused him of having histrionic personality disorder, bluntly calling him a clown. Unfazed, Townsend brought up his ex-wife, who had past dealings with Kristen. After that, Kristen called his ex-wife only to be informed by her mother that she had been hit by a truck on her way home and was now in a coma. Back at the church, Kristen reported to the bishop that Townsend was mentally ill. The bishop demanded proof, reminding her that psychological evaluation was part of her job. With no other choice, Kristen returned to Townsend for a psychological test, but it soon devolved into a heated confrontation. Townsend told Kristen that darkness had permeated her life and suggested a deal. He would stay away from her daughter if she could ensure David's priest examination fell through. Kristen took her daughter for dental surgery. During the procedure, the three were in a conference call, with Kristen insisting that Townsend was narcissistic. Ben offered a theory that Townsend might be seeking their help to reform. After a brief discussion, they ended the call only for Kristen's daughter, under anesthesia, to bite off the doctor's finger. After her daughter was taken home, the trio returned to the bishop's office. Looking at the evaluation report, the bishop asked for Kristen and David's interpretation. Kristen described Townsend as a long-term narcissist with signs of mental illness. David believed Townsend was trying to deceive the church for his own ends, using the exorcism as a smokescreen. However, the bishop decided to proceed with the exorcism on Townsend, much to Kristen's disappointment. As Kristen stormed out, the bishop asked the remaining two to be present when the exorcism was performed. In the evening, plagued by fears of another demonic dream, Ben stayed awake to monitor the surveillance. To his surprise, Townsend was already seated in front of the computer, mimicking Ben's actions. As Ben watched in disbelief, Townsend slowly leaned toward the camera. Early in the morning, David began his studies to become a priest. However, he soon disagreed with the clergyman's teachings. Coincidentally, the bishop came looking for David. The bishop informed him that a female parishioner believed her husband might be possessed by an angel and needed confirmation. Upon meeting, the woman informed everyone that her husband, Raymond, claimed he could hear instructions for good deeds from Archangel Michael. It started with simple acts like donating clothes and items. However, he was now preparing to quit his job and donate all of their possessions as per the supposed instructions. The wife supported her husband's philanthropy, but with their baby on the way and the prospect of becoming homeless, she felt desperate and turned to the church for help. The sudden claim of angelic possession rather than demonic left David rather baffled. The bishop told David their task was to convince Raymond there were no angelic instructions. He also asked Kristen to focus on Raymond's psychological issues, given that new converts often display excessive zeal. As for David, he was to call Townsend. Meanwhile, Townsend was selecting a wedding cake with Kristen's mother. When David called to inform him that the exorcism would be delayed by a month due to the exorcist attending a conference in the Vatican, Townsend was suspicious that David was sabotaging the process. David reassured him, expressing his eagerness to witness the exorcism, and promised to send some spiritual courses for Townsend's review. After hanging up, Townsend used a figurine from the cake to stab the cake shop owner in the eye. However, he was quickly snapped back to reality by the sound of Kristen's mother. Regaining his senses, Townsend began hurling insults at her, breaking up with her. He bluntly stated that he pursued her only to get close to Kristen and annoy her. Now that his goal was accomplished, he told her she could roll back to where she came from before storming out of the cake shop. Afterward, the trio arrived at Raymond's house. Raymond, who was drawing an angel on the wall, informed them that the angel had stopped speaking. The angel had previously told him he was God's medium and would accompany him until the mission was complete. Kristen asked what the mission was, to which Raymond replied, "The sacred bowl," which was said to belong to an angel. He then whispered to David to save him because the angel was coming for him. Back at the church, David reported to the bishop that Raymond might be mentally ill or possessed by a demon, but definitely not an angel. However, Kristen reserved her judgment, but Ben said nobody cared what it was, and Raymond was mentally ill. The bishop urged them to conduct a comprehensive assessment to determine what was really going on. In the evening, David went for his usual night run. As he was still upset about the argument earlier, he called Ben to discuss it. Ben advised David not to overthink things. When David returned to his room, he found himself face to face with Archangel Michael. The archangel spoke at length and presented a sacred bowl, as if wanting to beg for some food from him. David asked if he was indeed the archangel, but before he could get an answer, he was awakened by a nun who had dragged him off the floor. The nun told David not to sleep on the floor as it hindered her work. She also advised him not to use self-harm as a way of communicating with God, warning him that it could lead to his own demise. After saying this, she left the room. Once David came to his senses, he immediately followed her out. With the help of other nuns, he found the nun playing the piano. She advised David that if he wanted to talk to God, he should do so through prayer. She described his self-harm as a forced way of making God communicate with him. David confessed to the nun that he often dreamt of his friends being with demons and worried it could influence him. The nun downloaded a metronome app on her phone for him, saying that if he meditated to its beat, he could see God. She also reminded him not to harm himself for no reason and to use the app the next day. Meanwhile, Ben, who was in charge of monitoring Townsend, discovered something new. After writing an incomprehensible letter, Townsend began a ritual in front of the window. Seeing his bizarre behavior, Ben quickly recorded it. After finishing the ritual, Townsend seemed to remember something and opened a hidden compartment in his wardrobe. After putting a red thread back in its place, he called out Kristen's mother, who was aware of the secret compartment. He accused her of telling her daughter about the hidden area. Kristen's mother retorted with 2 slaps to his face, telling him to stop his bullshit. The next morning, David was called to the hospital by the bishop. Kristen learned from a new cop that Raymond had lifted a burning, overturned car with his bare hands to rescue a trapped family of 4 on his way home. But miraculously, Raymond was unscathed. The conversation then shifted to Orson's murder case. The new cop told Kristen that Officer Mira had transferred the case to her. The police had found that Orson's wife had an alibi, so they hoped Kristen could help investigate her background. Raymond, lying in his hospital bed, told David that it wasn't him who saved the trapped family, but the Archangel. David asked again about the sacred bowl, which was mentioned the previous day. However, Raymond told David he knew David had seen Archangel Michael. Back at his residence, David opened the app and began to meditate. He successfully saw the Archangel and asked about the sacred bowl. The Archangel told David that the sacred bowl was God's redemption and the rebirth after destruction. Seeing David question God, Michael revealed his weapon and stated, "God is the measure of justice." On the other side, due to a quarrel between Townsend and Kristen's mother, an angry Kristen's mother left a masterpiece in Townsend's office using her own blood. Early in the morning, Kristen and her two friends found Raymond again for a psychological test. However, Raymond told Kristen that the person speaking to her was not him. Ben noticed an untanned spot behind Raymond's ear and asked him whether he had applied anything there. David also asked Raymond if he was the angel who wrestled with Jacob, but he denied. When the topic of the sacred bowl was brought up, Raymond said that the angel would be the one to sound the horn of all disasters. After returning to their residence, Ben informed the other two of Raymond's job, which involved operating cranes on skyscrapers. Typically, people who work at high altitudes apply patches behind their ears to prevent dizziness and nausea. If the patches are not removed promptly, they can cause drug poisoning, leading to amnesia and hallucinations. Upon reaching home, Kristen started writing Raymond's assessment report. Then, she heard the sound of a car parking outside. Seeing that it was the new cop, Kristen quickly closed the compartment where she kept an ice pick. She told Kristen that from eyewitness testimonies and surveillance footage, it was found that Raymond had saved a married couple and their daughter from a car, but he had left the little girl's uncle, letting him burn in the fire for a full minute. Kristen immediately shared it with the others, adding that Raymond's mental state was very poor and it was necessary to meet him in person. Subsequently, the three found Raymond and began asking him questions. Upon hearing them, Raymond told the three that the little girl's uncle had offended the Lord, and the instruction he received was to get rid of the man. Only in this way could the man atone for his violation of his own niece. Kristen believed Raymond was dangerous, but David agreed with Raymond's actions. Ben, however, thought they should report the matter to the police. When Kristen heard David agree with the concept of righteous killing, she subtly mentioned her own act of killing. At that moment, a nun found Kristen and told her that Raymond's wife had come to the church to see her. The wife told Kristen that she could no longer tolerate Raymond. He was now insisting that they live according to the Bible and called it God's will. She wanted to divorce him, but she was worried about how Raymond might react to the divorce. Seeing her dilemma, Kristen gave her the phone number of a help center. Early the next day, the trio submitted their assessment report on Raymond to the bishop. They concluded that Raymond, having taken anti-dizziness medication, was experiencing hallucinations. They also suspected he might be suffering from severe depression. In response to the bishop's inquiry, David saw no need for an exorcism, as he was unsure whether it was a demon or an angel that had possessed Raymond. This was unlike any theology he had studied. Just then, the clergyman who was tutoring David arrived at the office. They informed him that they had found a way for him to pass his theological examination by hearing a person's confession. This person had clearly stated that he had previously misunderstood David. David realized the person was definitely Townsend. The revelation that the confessor was Townsend caused David to burst into laughter. The four of them then went to Raymond's home and found him in the empty room. When asked about his wife, Raymond pointed to a pile of salt, comparing his wife to Lot's wife from the Bible, which indicates that his wife had been killed and turned into salt due to her doubts on him. As he was to participate in a confession, Townsend came to the church. Coincidentally, he was spotted by a nun who was cleaning the floors. She pointed out that Townsend had the scent of a demon. After explaining that this was a confession, the nun was sent away. The confession then began, with the two men back to back. Townsend mentioned David's deceased girlfriend and confessed that when he learned the girl had fallen seriously ill, he had found her and brainwashed her, encouraging her to terminate herself to free her lover. David, who had been silently gripping his crucifix, watched as Townsend finished his confession. After instructing Townsend to recite a prayer several times, David returned to his room. The sound of the nun's voice reached him as he looked at his hand, stained with blood. Seeing that, the nun told David that she would help him. David then presented the devil sigils, hoping the nun could help translate the special letters marked by Townsend. Seeing the nun's confusion, David shared his hypothesis. The sigil might be related to the RSM fertility. Each sigil might represent a child born in the institution. The fertility's records had been erased, and the children's mothers couldn't be found. The nun took another close look at the chart. She finally noticed that the letters were written in different scripts. After translating, she pieced together a child's name, Matilda. With the name in hand, the three found Matilda's home. Matilda's biological mother was imprisoned on suspicion of arson, so Matilda had been adopted. The adoptive father was a Catholic, and the mother was a Muslim. They were trying to introduce Matilda to both religions. The couple told the trio that since they had adopted Matilda, there had been 3 fires at their home within a year. However, Matilda insisted she didn't start the fires. They had sought help from a psychologist before, but to no avail. Kristen decided to have a chat with Matilda first. Watching Kristen enter the room, Matilda pulled out her pre-packed things from under the bed, ready to leave with her. After she told Matilda that she had only come for a chat, she noticed a tea set identical to one her daughter had. Kristen asked if she didn't start the fires, then why did they happen in her house? Matilda answered that if she told the truth, bad things would happen. Seeing Kristen's determination to know the truth, Matilda told her when she was very young, every time she slept, a spirit with a flaming head and no eyes would enter her room. He would start a fire whenever she got angry. After she told the social workers about this, they took her mom away. But the spirit didn't disappear. No matter where she went, he would appear and start fires. Kristen then shared with everyone that Matilda might have a pyromania or be imitating her biological mother's arson behavior. Moreover, she was blaming the fires on a so-called spirit with a flaming head. Kristen, thinking of her daughter who also had a similar tea set, immediately threw the tea set into the trash bin when returning home. But to be safe, she deceived her daughter and took the tea set out. The next day, David and the others came to ask Matilda's adoptive parents if they knew the spirit Matilda was talking about. The adoptive father showed them a surveillance video where Matilda was continuously saying, "Go away, stop it!" A few minutes later, the storage room spontaneously combusted. To understand the spirit Matilda was talking about, Ben, an atheist whose family practiced Islam, started researching. When he described the man, Ben's sister identified him as the Ifrit, a demonic entity from Islamic lore. Now knowing what the evil spirit was, David and the others once again visited Matilda's house for investigation. At that moment, Ben found a box in the room containing chlorine tablets for swimming pools and brake fluid. If these two substances were combined, a spontaneous combustion reaction would occur after a few minutes. But Matilda still insisted that those items were not hers. Seeing her adoptive parents wanting to know the truth, Matilda told them about the Ifrit threatening her to find the next host, or else it wouldn't leave. Suddenly, Matilda seemed possessed, gripping Kristen and speaking in Arabic that the fierce fire would devour everyone who comes near it, and then possessed one of them. Kristen was stunned and drove home. While waiting at a traffic light, an amazing scene unfolded. The Ifrit was standing across the intersection. At night, Ben once again encountered the demon searching for him in his dream. He informed the demon that he had activated the recording function on his phone and would know what he had spoken in his sleep once he woke up. However, when Ben awoke, he found that nothing had been recorded on his phone. Early in the morning, the foster father sought the church, hoping they could perform an exorcism for Matilda. Ben questioned her foster father that since his daughter saw an Islamic evil spirit, he should ask his wife or consult the Muslim leader first. Meanwhile, Kristen received a call from her mother. After hanging up, she hurried home. After her separation with Townsend, she attempted to mend her relationship with her daughter, so she assumed a pseudonym and sought help from Kristen's psychologist. After understanding the overall situation, the psychologist advised that it would be best to find a third party who has contact with both sides to mediate. So Kristen's mother came to the school to find her granddaughter. Upon returning home and seeing her daughter, she confessed that she had broken up with Townsend and then apologized, seeking forgiveness. Eventually, the mother and daughter embraced and reconciled. On the other hand, Ben, who had not captured anything, decided to upgrade to video recording. After setting up his phone, he climbed into bed to sleep. At this time, Kristen, sound asleep like a pig, was awakened by a wet hormone dream. Longing for a man's muscles, she then left home and headed to the bar where she successfully attracted a handsome man. The handsome man invited Kristen to another place for a deeper interaction. However, under the pretext of going to the restroom, Kristen changed her mind and slipped out of the bar through the back door. On her way home, she saw the Ifrit in her car again. After seeing the Ifrit twice in succession, Kristen sought her psychologist and confessed that she saw the Ifrit whenever she felt a thrill. She also requested some medication used to treat delusional disorders. The doctor suggested that Kristen should come in for intensive therapy twice a week. As he was writing the prescription, he asked about her family members. He found out that his new patient had the same name as Kristen's mother, and the descriptions matched remarkably. After Kristen left, the psychologist felt they might be the same person and conducted an online search. Sure enough, he found a photograph of her with Kristen. When his assistant brought Kristen's mother to her, the doctor showed her the photograph. She denied any connection initially, but became emotional, sobbing while begging for understanding and help. The doctor gave in and agreed to find a new psychologist for her the following week. After that, Kristen, David, and the exorcist hurried to Matilda's house. However, they were informed by the foster father that Matilda's mother had brought in a Muslim exorcist. Upon meeting, the two exorcists from different faiths started a war of words. David suggested that since they were both there to exorcise Matilda and there were no rules against simultaneous exorcisms, they should cooperate this time. The Muslim exorcist began chanting, and not long after, Matilda let out a piercing chicken scream. Recognizing that a different demon had taken hold, the Christian exorcist began his exorcism. Just then, Matilda turned to tell Kristen that the Lord of Hell would embrace her with his gentle hellfire. Having returned home, Kristen went to her daughter's room to check on her. As her elder daughter promised to take care of her younger sister after she left, Kristen prepared to go out, but was surprised to find the abandoned tea set at the foot of her younger daughter's bed. Looking at her sleeping daughter, Kristen returned to her room and changed into a sexy dress, ready to go out to hunt a muscular man. However, she saw the Ifrit outside the window again, and after taking her medication, she lost the mood to go out and lay on her bed. At the same time, Matilda sat alone on the grass after the exorcism, watching the big fire in the garbage can. The previous exorcism for Townsend had been postponed for a month because the exorcist had a meeting at the Vatican. Now the exorcism was finally taking place. However, Townsend was merely playing along with the exorcist. After the exorcism was completed, Townsend asked about his condition. The exorcist gave a positive response, but also mentioned that since he had willingly offered his soul to Satan, they might need to arrange a few more exorcisms. Before the second exorcism, a mental consultant would be assigned. On hearing this, Townsend said he didn't need one, as he thought David was good enough and they knew each other well. Just then, David received a text from his partner Ben, who was on a new mission. Ben and Kristen were talking with a couple who told them their son had never returned after a trip to the grocery store in September. They had reported it to the police, but the police insisted that their son had merely run away from home. The father also mentioned that he had received a phone call the day after his son disappeared. It was very noisy around him, and he could only hear someone crying for help before the connection was lost. Kristen and the others explained that missing person cases were not within the jurisdiction of the church. Hearing this, the father suggested they take a look at his son's room. Upon entering the room, the father lifted the carpet to reveal a pentagram on the floor. The mother opened the door for the arriving David and returned to tell everyone that their son had never been into magic. So she wondered if this had anything to do with a religious kidnapping. At that moment, Kristen noticed a string of small characters carved on the table. Once she returned home, Kristen started to search for information online, just as her daughters returned from school. Seeing that, the eldest daughter told Kristen that the game mentioned in the note was the elevator game, and they showed her a video explaining it. The game required a building with at least 13 floors and an unoccupied elevator. After reaching the 4th floor and preventing the elevator doors from closing, the player would then go to the 2nd floor. He would then press the button for the 13th floor and the call button simultaneously. When he arrived at the 13th floor, he would see a woman. He were to ignore the woman and press the button for the 1st floor. In this way, when the player reached the 1st floor, he would find himself in the underworld. The video also warned that the player could only stay in this space for 12 minutes. Any mistake could result in being haunted by an evil spirit. If the player were unfortunately haunted, he just needed to draw a pentagram in his own house. Realizing something from the video, Kristen called Ben and agreed to meet at the apartment where the couple's son disappeared. As she left the room, she saw her daughters who wanted to go with her. After some negotiation, and leaving behind her second daughter who had a tutoring session in 10 minutes, Kristen took the other daughters to the apartment. Through the surveillance footage, they saw the missing boy on the 1st floor of the apartment. However, when the second batch of guests entered the elevator, there was no sign of him. Because the rooftop elevator had no surveillance, the police believed that the missing boy might have reached the top floor and then left the apartment via the stairs. Over at David's, he began giving mental counseling to Townsend, who was always clinging to him. David was at a loss for words and felt helpless. After handing over the cross necklace to Townsend, he instructed him to put it on immediately. David watched his exaggerated performance, then handed him the rosary prayers, reminding him to recite them in the morning and at night. However, Townsend started discussing religion with him and shifted to racial discrimination. Not wanting to prolong the conversation, David got up to leave, reminding Townsend not to remove the necklace before he left. Back at the apartment, Kristen, who initially didn't plan to let her daughters play the elevator game, decided to let them do it after hearing the security guard offer to watch over them. They started the game in the correct order, but found that the apartment did not have a 13th floor. Thinking that the 14th floor was equivalent to the 13th, Kristen simultaneously pressed the buttons for the 14th floor and the call button. However, they heard a staff member asking about it. After telling them it was a mistake, they returned to the first floor. The group came out and started discussing the elevator game. At this time, an Afro girl warned them not to play the evil game. It turned out she was also investigating the boy's disappearance and revealed that her best friend and the boy were a couple. Her best friend also came here to play the elevator game in order to find her boyfriend and disappeared mysteriously. For safety, she maintained a call with her all throughout. She then played the recording of their call. At first, everything was normal, but then the connection became unstable, and after a chicken scream, the connection was completely lost. After listening to the recording, Kristen took her reluctant daughters back home. Ben decided to ask for help from an old friend, Vanessa. The scene shifted to David, who was taking a simulated preaching course in order to become a verified priest. He was also preparing to give a speech on racial discrimination. However, the tutor advised David to change the topic to avoid misunderstanding. But David insisted that those issues were his core topics. After class, another intern priest approached David and told him that he was a spokesperson for people of his kind in the church. He then invited David to a gathering that night. In the evening, Vanessa arrived at Ben's house as promised. Ben knew Vanessa was familiar with haunted buildings and mentioned the elevator game and played the recording from the Afro girl. After listening, Vanessa took Ben on a ghost tour. At Vanessa's request, the tour guide vividly recounted the elevator story. Years ago, a little girl was walking her dog. Just as the elevator doors were about to close, the dog ran out. The girl followed, but she was trapped by the closing elevator doors. At that moment, the elevator suddenly fell, leading to the girl's death. Since then, residents often heard the sound of someone dragging half a body down the hallway. When Ben returned to Kristen's office, he relayed the urban legend he had just heard to the two of them. Simultaneously, he shared Vanessa's suggestion to complete the game. The problem was that the apartment building didn't have a 13th floor. Back home, Kristen also heard the ticking sound. Initially thinking it was a hallucination, Kristen took some medication, but the sound continued. Following the noise downstairs, Kristen discovered her mother was using the computer. Seeing her mother preparing to leave, Kristen hoped she could stay an extra hour so she could go out and run some errands. With the excuse of taking care of her granddaughter, Kristen's mother suggested setting up a bed in Kristen's office. Later, Kristen returned to the apartment to play the elevator game again. When the elevator reached between the 12th and 14th floors, she hit the stop button. Upon opening the door, she encountered what seemed to be an abandoned floor. As Kristen stuck her head out to inspect, she was trapped by the suddenly moving elevator. At that moment, she saw a ghost woman crawling towards her. Just as the ghost was about to crawl into the elevator, Kristen pressed the elevator button and returned to the first floor. Once out, she called her psychologist and informed him that the previous therapy did not relieve her hallucinations, but seemed to intensify them. Kristen then summoned Ben and asked the tour guide how to get to the 13th floor. The guide suggested trying to stop the elevator between the 12th and 14th floors, but Kristen told them she had already tried. Having split up from Kristen, Ben arrived at the elevator alone. Listening to the recording, Ben finally realized that it wasn't 13, but pressing 1 and 3 simultaneously. The elevator then started moving downward and arrived at the 0th floor. After some inspection, he found the missing boy, who was already dead. When Ben was preparing to leave, he found the elevator buttons were broken. On the other hand, David arrived at the gathering. When David expressed his faith in God, a guy nearby mocked him as a sycophant to white people. David didn't hold back, delivering a punch to the man. Recognizing his overreaction, David prepared to leave the gathering. A bald guy sitting on the couch ran after him, telling David they were on the same side and invited him to visit his church. He also told David they did things the Catholic Church didn't do. Back at the church, David was found by the priest who wanted to talk again about the preaching content. However, David still insisted on addressing racial issues. The next day, David began to officiate his first mass, but the audience was sparse. Still, two familiar faces did show up, Kristen and Townsend munching on popcorn. Following the mass, Townsend, in a departure from his usual attitude, gave David a big thumbs up. At this moment, Ben called Kristen, but she couldn't understand what Ben was saying. Seeing the slew of missed calls and Ben's absence from where he should be, David asked Kristen about what had transpired the night before. At the same time, Ben noticed the phone battery was below 10%, and looking at the bodies of the two people, he was emotionally overwhelmed and started shouting at the elevator. Just as he was lamenting his solitary demise, the demon from his dreams appeared to flex its ugly figure, causing Ben to rush towards the elevator. At the same time, the demon began reciting Islamic teachings. Knowing he was trapped, Ben used the last of his battery to leave a message. Atheist Ben found himself reciting Islamic scriptures. At that moment, the elevator doors slowly opened. Seeing Kristen preparing to exit, Ben shouted not to close the elevator doors, then rushed inside. Having escaped, Ben once again saw the demon greeting him. The scene shifts to an early morning when David begins his theology course and notices a bloody mark on the priest's back. After the others leave, the priest tells David that his back has been bleeding recently, feeling like he's under some attack, leading to irritability and a lack of desire to pray. Thinking it might be due to intense exorcism rituals, David suggests the priest undergo a secret assessment by his team. He then calls Kristen. The priest tells Kristen that he was a gambling addict in his youth, but gave it up after becoming a priest. However, he recently fell back into the habit. He insists it's not a mental issue, but a simple resurgence of his gambling addiction, which he can overcome with willpower. After ending the conversation, Kristen tells David that the priest is suffering from mania, a simple case of substitution trauma, unrelated to demons. She also reminds David not to blame everything on Townsend. Nearby, Ben decides to check the priest's computer. Seeing Ben, David suggests he rest for a while. Ben dismisses the suggestion, saying he was only locked up for a night, and leads the way to find the priest. Observing the pop-up ads on the computer, Ben tells everyone that the priest was merely trapped by the algorithm and lured back into gambling by the ads. To prove his determination not to gamble again, the priest lets Ben install ad-blocking software after inputting his computer password. Seeing the two leave, Kristen, who knows Ben is up to something, becomes curious. Ben tells Kristen he checked the priest's email, which was empty. Based on experience, he suspects the priest is hiding something. When he returns, David objects to Ben accessing the priest's recent email addresses without permission. However, after Ben explains it's part of the assessment, David finds his argument reasonable. Following Kristen's instructions, Ben successfully contacts the other party and proposes a face-to-face meeting to understand the situation better. When Kristen returned home and checked her computer, she also saw the ads that were pushed her way. Just as she was about to click and watch one, her daughter found her and asked if there were really demons in this world. Kristen explained to her daughter that the demons people speak of are really just the deeds people do when they lose themselves. Just then, Ben's call came in. Kristen asked him why her computer was filled with ads about dating people, not knowing that her longing for a man was detected by the algorithm. Ben told Kristen to bring her computer to him the next day and he would help resolve the issue. At this moment, Kristen saw the demon Ifrit again. Snapping back to reality, she was informed by Ben that he had found the contact of the priest, who turned out to be the debtor's henchman. Moreover, the priest had lost $40,000 online. Subsequently, David found the priest, and upon learning that his debt had been exposed, the priest pleaded with David not to report this to the bishop. David agreed to keep the secret, but made a request that the priest take a 6-month leave and attend a gambling addiction program. That night, Ben was awakened by an alarm from his computer. Seeing that Townsend was chatting with someone, Ben opened a screen share. To his surprise, he found that Townsend was discussing an exorcism with the priest for the next day. Because of the priest's situation, David sought advice from the nun. However, she told David that the priest liked to show off and would not voluntarily give up performing exorcisms, as he enjoyed the drama of it. Upon hearing that David would also be participating in the exorcism the next day, the nun declared that she would join as well. The next day, the well-dressed Townsend welcomed the second exorcism ceremony. As agreed, the nun also arrived at the house. When Kristen and another person arrived, the exorcism officially began. Observing the extravagant performances of Townsend and the priest left everyone speechless. Seeing the priest struggle against Townsend, the nun pulled out a cross and said he did not have the power to overcome God. But Townsend sternly told the nun they would see about that. Ignoring the mockery, the nun handed holy water over to David. Then, something miraculous happened. The places that were wet from the holy water showed a reaction. Just as everyone was still in shock, Townsend, who was in pain and screaming, ran out for his shitty life. Because of that, David found the nun the next day and asked her to join his team. However, the nun told David to believe in himself and in God. She then asked David to help dump the mop water. As David left, the nun took out the holy water but poured it back into the cleaning ammonia bottle. The scene shifts to Kristen's daughter, Lila, who was watching a zombie movie from Daniel CC Movie Channel with her best friend from next door. After returning from the bathroom, Lila heard a strange noise outside the window. When she looked out, she saw a slow-moving figure that resembled a zombie. The two curious girls chased after it, but to no avail. Hearing the noise, the sisters ran out to tell their mother that Lila was hallucinating due to the movie. After Kristen sent the giggling sisters back home, Lila, revealing the blood on her feet, told her friend that something must have happened in the back alley. To find out what it was, Lila and her friend decided to keep watch in the yard that night to see if they could catch a glimpse of the zombie. However, they saw the figure in the friend's room instead. They immediately went to the room and heard a rumbling growl. Just as they were about to open the wardrobe following the sound, they were startled by the friend's mother who suddenly appeared. With her mother present, the friend opened the wardrobe only to find that the noise was coming from a pop-up book. The persistent pair once again changed their hiding spot, this time directly into the wardrobe. Again, they saw the figure. Seeing the figure enter the room, the girls began to eavesdrop, only to be startled by the friend's father, who suddenly opened the door. The friend, who was pulled up, saw the wound on her father's hand. During the day, her best friend confided in Lila about a strange incident. She noticed that her father, upon returning home from work, just stood still staring at the wall, not uttering a single word. Just then, Lila spotted a delivery truck from a courier company parked outside. She heard her friend mention that her father also worked at this company. On seeing the workers who moved like zombies, she quickly made a connection. The figures she saw that night could possibly have been these workers. The two returned to their room to research further, but instead, they found numerous records of the company mistreating its employees. Recognizing the scars on the interviewee's hands, the friend realized that the man was her father. It became clear that the delivery company was exploiting its staff to the point of inducing zombie-like symptoms. In order to help the friend's father regain his normal state, the two went to a shop. After stating their intent, the shopkeeper explained a story contrived by slave owners to prevent slaves from killing themselves. The shopkeeper also prepared 2 potions, a blue one for the friend's father and a green one for the manager. Once home, they added the potion to the father's food. The next morning, the friend was told that her parents were still asleep. Suddenly, the father rushed out of the room, worried about getting fired. He called his manager, only to find out that due to a gas leak in the warehouse, he had narrowly escaped disaster by oversleeping. All other colleagues were sent to the hospital. Seeing his father return to normal, the 2 girls happily said all they needed to do now was find the manager. That evening, due to the gas leak and the hospitalization of 40 colleagues, all had lost their jobs. The friend's father and his co-workers discussed forming a union. Just then, the manager arrived. While he was negotiating with the workers, the 2 girls dripped the green potion onto his chewing gum. The next morning, the 2 girls heard the news that the friend's father had been promoted to the position of the new manager. Ironically, after becoming a manager, the father showed his wife how he could remotely instruct workers via a computer when taking his daughter to school. When they finished their homework, Lila invited her friend to finish watching the unfinished zombie movie that night, but was turned down. Early in the morning, a representative from the police union visited the church seeking help. The previous night, a police officer named Turley shot a driver to death, mistakenly thinking that the driver was reaching for a gun. The tricky part was that the driver was African American, and the incident could be misconstrued as racial discrimination. Plus, Turley was a devoted Catholic who insisted that he was possessed by a demon that night. Therefore, he hoped the church could provide some evidence to support this. When they exited the church, they saw Turley, who had been waiting there. He told them he knew that the driver was African American and indeed saw him reaching for something he mistook as a gun. He expressed regret over the driver's death and said he was just following procedure. When asked if he would have done the same if the driver were white, he hesitated before answering he would. Soon, the union representative brought in the results of Turley's lie detector test, which confirmed that he mistook the driver's cell phone for a gun. However, David believed that Officer Turley was enforcing the law with racial bias. The bishop suspected that maybe it was Satan who exploited racism to create trouble. At home, Kristen and her police friend Mira discussed Turley's case. Mira concluded that the man was not possessed by a demon and didn't demonstrate racial bias. However, they were sure that due to occupational stress, police officers often mistaken ordinary objects for guns. She also mentioned the Orson's murder case, saying the police suspected Orson's wife of instigating her new boyfriend to murder Orson, as the boyfriend had a criminal record. They reminded each other to stay in touch if there were any updates. On the other end, Ben started studying the working principle of a lie detector. In a strange turn of events, he fell asleep while watching a live feed from a security camera. In his sleep, he dreamt of a demon who was playing a lie detection game with him, questioning him about a child gene modification experiment he was once involved in. The demon stabbed him 3 times when he refused to answer. He woke up from his nightmare as he was about to fight back. The next day, David revealed to the two of them that the tattoo on Turley's wrist was one of the devil sigils. He also brought forth videos where he had been pulled over by the police for 5 times over the past year. Kristen and Ben were surprised, as neither of them had experienced this even once in the past 10 years. In the videos, the same symbol appeared on the police officer's wrist. Just then, Kristen received a text message from her mother. Upon reading the content, she hurried home. While waiting for Kristen to return, Officer Mira saw the altar on the table. However, Kristen's mother didn't comment on it but mentioned her fondness for the scent of candles. After Kristen returned home and blew out the candles, her mother carried the altar back to the studio. Mira informed Kristen that the new boyfriend of Orson's wife had been found and had an alibi. She came over to check if there were any clues from Kristen since Orson had previously threatened Kristen's family. Kristen told her that she had returned home after completing an exorcism ceremony on the night of the incident, and her daughter could vouch for her alibi. Kristen asked if Mira knew about the devil's sigil within the police force. Mira told Kristen that this was just superstition within the police force and was a long-standing tradition. She could check the forum for more details. Kristen then found her second daughter, Lexis, and instructed her to help fabricate an alibi. Lexis agreed to lie for her. After that, Kristen and Ben started investigating. Seeing a dispirited Ben, Kristen became concerned about his sleep quality. When Ben admitted that he often woke up due to nightmares, Kristen took off a bracelet from her and put it on Ben. She advised him to set his phone to vibrate at 4:10 a.m. and to check his wrist when the alarm went off. If the bracelet wasn't there, it meant he was still dreaming. To kill the dream terror, he could place a weapon under the pillow. That's how she had rid herself of nightmares. After explaining, Kristen saw the devil's sigil on the forum and reported this to the bishop. They concluded that this was a small group within the police force with its own motto. Hearing them wanting to dig deeper into police affairs, the bishop told them to stop and focus on the new case. Seeing their unwillingness to drop it, the bishop continued, explaining that it was just a simple imitation of a police group from a cop drama. David suggested that cop dramas are the root of all evil. Subsequently, they arrived at the set of a police drama. Because they were friends of the director, he readily told them that the devil sigil was inspired by a spiritual mentor and had appeared in cop dramas as far back as the 1950s. Knowing they were investigating the Turley case, the director thought it was impossible for the drama to influence Turley in that negative way, saying TV dramas were for entertaining the public and helping people discern good from evil. In Kristen's yard, her mother was showing concern for Lexis, who seemed to be in a low-spirited mood. However, Lexis was reticent, only mentioning that her mother wanted her to tell a lie. But Kristen's mother said that lying would harm Kristen and that the truth should be told. She then took Lexis to her studio and began a creepy ritual that would offer Lexis to the Eddie doll for help, which indicates that the Eddie doll might be a member of the Devil's 60 group. Lexis creeped out and ran out of the studio. Back home, Ben started reading about the latest developments in genetic modification. Worried he might continue having nightmares, Ben played a VR game before setting his alarm as per Kristen's advice. As expected, the demon found Ben on the dot. However, this time, Ben was prepared. He broke free of his bonds, picked up a small knife from the floor, and prepared to fight the demon. But he was told he was outnumbered, 2-1. Turning around, Ben was surprised to see David in his dream. Later, Ben found David and mentioned that he had once been involved in a genetic modification project. He also asked David how he could seek forgiveness as an atheist. David told him it wasn't hard. He just needed to seek forgiveness from something bigger than himself, like a tree, a forest, or even a post office. He just needed to genuinely pray for forgiveness. Following this advice, Ben went to the post office, and after asking the other party to say, "I forgive you," he felt forgiven and contentedly returned to the church. There, he encountered the representative from the police union who informed him that the jury had pardoned Officer Turley and expressed his gratitude to the three. As David came out, the representative warned with a smile that they should consider the matter closed and not seek trouble or bother the drama director. Later, the bishop presented a new case. Father Thomas from the monastery had died of natural causes the previous year. However, a week ago, noises began emanating from his grave. Upon opening the grave, they discovered that Father Thomas's body showed no signs of decay. The Vatican hoped to prove through DNA evidence that Father Thomas's remains were incorruptible. However, the bishop stated that because the monastery was a silent one, the three of them would not be able to communicate with each other for a week while inside. When they returned home to pack, Ben and David received special attention from the police and were forced to stop for a search, while Kristen, being a white, arrived at home without any trouble, packing to go to the monastery. That night, Kristen was startled awake and went to the window, where she saw a figure outside. After calling her officer friend Mira, she saw someone attempting to break into the house. Kristen grabbed an ice pick from the partition and chased after the intruder. To her shock, she found it was the serial killer Orson, whom she had previously killed. As Orson rambled on, Kristen lunged at him. Just then, Mira and the new cop arrived. Seeing the ice pick and hearing Kristen's confession of guilt, Mira realized it was Kristen who killed Orson. After sending her colleague away, Mira told Kristen that it wasn't her fault. Orson's death was deserved, and she would report to her superiors that Orson had many enemies and that finding the real killer would be difficult. She then returned the ice pick to Kristen. Watching Mira leave, Kristen fell to her knees and started crying. David and his team were assigned to investigate a case at the Silent Monastery. They were tasked to look into the phenomenon of Father Thomas's body that did not decay after his death. Upon their arrival, a monk greeted them with a sign for silence, then pointed to a notice on the side. Just as they entered the monastery, the monk named Emmanuel requested the three of them to hand over their mobile phones. When he learned that they needed to use their phones for taking photos, he removed the SIM cards before returning the phones to Ben. Then, he distributed a drawing board to each of them for communication. Once everything was ready, Father Winston led them to Father Thomas's tomb. In the tomb, Ben began to collect DNA samples from the corpse. David extracted a fingernail sample and then handed over the collected samples to the staff waiting outside. On the way back, Ben asked Emmanuel to show him another miracle in the monastery. Arriving at the same room where Thomas's body was placed, Ben saw the so-called miracle. It's a cabinet oozing with a clear liquid. As David suggested that a demon was contained within, Ben curiously began to inspect it. Just as he was about to touch it, Emmanuel hurriedly stopped him. Meanwhile, Kristen stepped out and began to seduce the monk. She then saw a young nun who had knocked over a bottle of wine. After helping her clean up, Kristen saw the nun struggling with a cart and offered help. They got to know each other and bond. After cleaning Kristen's feet and changing her gear, the nun let her experience the task of cleaning wine barrels. Kristen, enjoying the work with the help of the wine, let out a laugh. Just then, Father Winston arrived with David. After his signal, the young nun removed the bandage from her hand, revealing a wound. When David asked if it was caused by Father Thomas's cross, Father Winston nodded. The three then climbed over the monastery's wall and started discussing what they had found. Kristen believed the wound on the nun's hand was merely a symptom caused by pushing the cart for a long time. She mentioned that just pushing it for 5 minutes left a mark on her hand. As for Father Thomas's undecayed body, Ben speculated that it might be related to some sort of calcification in the tomb. David recounted the story Father Winston had told him earlier. The cabinet in Corpse's room contained a demon that wanted to destroy the world. If anyone spoke, the demon would appear. Hence, the monastery had a rule of silence, even requiring the use of mouth tape while sleeping at night. Upon returning to the monastery, Kristen summoned the young nun and the monk and began to scientifically explain the wound on the young nun's hand. However, after asking the monk to step aside for a moment, the young nun revealed multiple wounds on her body, especially under her ribs. Kristen, looking at the images of Jesus' passion, wondered if the young nun's wounds could actually be stigmata. Exiting the room, Kristen went to the corpse's room and was drawn to touch the cabinet. Luckily, David stopped her in time. Kristen then revealed the multiple wounds she had seen on the young nun's body to David. After letting Kristen first photograph the nun's wounds, David told Father Winston, expressing his desire to see the cross that Father Thomas wore during his lifetime. Winston retrieved the cross and handed it to David, reminding him that what he needed to do now was to calm down. Under his guidance, David participated in silent prayer, but his mind began to wander, and he thought of Kristen. Returning to his room, David just happened to see Kristen, who had finished taking photos and had come to find him. After showing the wounds of the young nun, Kristen left first. David was dumbfounded when he saw Kristen's note on his drawing board that read, "I want you." On the other hand, Ben seized the chance while everyone was having dinner to go to the tomb and collect samples. He noticed several scratch marks on the father's coffin plank. Ben felt a chill down his spine, feeling as though there was something else in the tomb. He bravely checked it out, but the more he saw, the more scared he became. After hurriedly taking a few photos, he returned to the dining hall in a fright. As the monastery had separate dining arrangements for men and women, Father Winston brought Kristen's meal to the nuns. This annoyed Kristen, but luckily the young nun was friendly. Seeing the whiskey that the young nun had secretly taken out, Kristen laughed out loud. During the meal, she noticed David stealing glances at her from time to time. This made her imagination run wild with romance, but she was brought back to reality by the sound of a plate smashing. It turned out that because Kristen had laughed out loud, the monks, who were supposed to be silent, expressed their anger by smashing plates. After dinner, Kristen was led to her room by the young nun. The room, however, was far from satisfactory. It was a storeroom. Kristen wasn't able to sleep, so she started to taunt the Grim Reaper. As a result, she dreamt of the Grim Reaper coming to collect her in the middle of the night. At this moment, an alarm from the corpse's room woke her up. When she got to the room, she discovered that the cabinet sealing the demon had been opened. At the same time, several monks in the monastery began to let out cries of pain. After assisting the young nun back to her room, the monastery was in utter chaos. In the midst of the crowd, Kristen used the drawing board to tell the monks that their priority should be to call a doctor. However, David believed that a demonic talisman was to blame. Unable to communicate verbally, Ben promptly called both of them out. Once outside, Kristen began to argue with David. Regardless of whether it was a demonic talisman or a demon, they must find a doctor. If they continue to mess around, someone will definitely get hurt. With that, she went to grab her phone. Ben returned to the monastery and found Emmanuel requesting a SIM card. However, Emmanuel led Ben to the only computer with internet access. After Father Winston arrived and took Emmanuel away, he guided David to meet the priest who exorcised demons for Townsend. Father Winston hoped the priest could help with the exorcism. When the priest applied ointment, the young nun started bleeding black blood, scratching herself in pain and eventually passed out. Due to the scratching, swarms of flies emerged from her skin. After Ben finished researching and saw the injuries, he poured alcohol on the young nun's wounds. He informed the others that the symptoms at the monastery were not due to any demon, but a common insect in northern New York known as the botfly. He deduced that when Father Thomas's coffin was taken out, the botflies were brought out as well. Once the skin's pores are filled, the suffocating botflies would burrow out of the skin to escape the host. After the truth was revealed, treatment began in the monastery. After returning Father Thomas's body to the crypt, David politely declined Father Winston's invitation to stay. Kristen, in anticipation of her husband Andy's return from a climbing trip, relaxed in a bath while sipping on the whiskey she brought back from the monastery. As her daughters excitedly welcomed their dad home, Kristen practiced smiling in the mirror. Once they retreated to their room, Andy expressed his desire for hormone intimacy. 2 minutes later, after they finished their fishy moments, Andy noticed a burn on Kristen's stomach. She explained it as an accident while making pancakes on the stove, leaving Andy puzzled. To his surprise, Kristen initiated a playful session of role play and bondage. Little did they know, an unknown liquid seeped from the bed to the basement. The next morning, the trio received a new case to investigate a research project at Cornell University. According to the report, a significant number of test subjects experienced religious hallucinations, with 10% converting to Christianity afterward. The Vatican was interested in whether the project could be utilized for church development. Upon their arrival at the lab, the researchers explained that although the experiment was initially aimed at studying Alzheimer's disease, data showed that 30% of the test subjects experienced religious hallucinations. To understand the reason, the trio interviewed some of the test subjects who experienced these hallucinations. The visions varied greatly among subjects, from seeing guides to long-deceased celebrities, but overall they elicited positive responses and even cured a patient suffering from depression. Kristen and Ben had a disagreement. Kristen believed that the church hoped to change people's religious beliefs through scientific means, questioning why a considerable number of subjects did not receive divine revelation. Neither could persuade the other. Just then, a researcher who had finished calibrating the machine emerged, asking who would go first. Seeing the hesitant duo, Ben volunteered. As he was gearing up for the countdown, the researcher told David that the stimulation only took a few seconds. However, the machine quickly sounded an alarm. Ben was already in tears. He told everyone that he hadn't seen anything and felt as if he had just slept. He even claimed he saw his mother, who had been dead for many years. Hearing his mother complain about his abandonment of faith, Ben defended himself, saying that he became a scientist as she wished, and that it was not him who had given up on Allah, but Allah who had rejected him. His mother told him that this was heaven, and because he didn't believe in religion, he couldn't see God. She also pointed out a beautiful woman to Ben, who realized she was a ghost. Frightened, Ben quickly removed the equipment. Kristen thought that this might be related to their previous confinement in the basement. Faced with David's questioning, the researcher had to admit that some of the previous test subjects had also seen visions of hell. At the church, Townsend, embarrassed from the last exorcism where he was tricked with ammonia, confronted the nun. He unveiled his bandaged wound and attempted to retaliate with ammonia. However, upon seeing the nun pull out a knife, Townsend backed down, jokingly suggesting that she was the true custodian of the church. He prepared to leave just as David returned. Seeing Townsend hastily depart, David approached the nun with concern. The nun, however, advised that their priority should be to strengthen their meditation practices as their enemies' attacks had intensified. Back home, Ben reached out to Kristen to inquire about his mother's attitude towards him and whether she left him any last words. Upon learning that Ben had only dreamt of his mother and was here to seek answers, Kristen decided to get some sleep. Early the next morning, Kristen rushed back to the university where David and Ben were interviewing a test subject who claimed to have seen hell. The test subject described seeing a colossal winged creature, its wings adorned with screaming naked people. The researcher reassured them that these visions were normal post-experiment reactions and that the test subjects only occasionally experienced related nightmares. Kristen volunteered to participate in the next test, confident that she wouldn't see hell or demons. As she was getting ready, she noticed her shoelaces had come undone. However, at that moment, David insisted on taking her place in the test. Once David was hooked up to the equipment, he saw the entire process of Kristen killing the serial killer Orson. After removing the equipment, David looked at Kristen, wanting to say something but holding back. Once they were alone, Kristen asked David what he had seen. Upon learning that David knew she had killed Orson, Kristen hastily made an excuse to see her psychologist. The psychologist advised Kristen to talk things over with David. Only then could she effectively alleviate her physical and emotional symptoms. Taking the advice, Kristen prepared to confess to David. As Kristen was tying her shoelaces, she looked up to see a horrific scene: Townsend gnawing on David's arm, which made her scream in a chicken voice. After removing the equipment, Ben asked her what she had seen. It turned out that there was no test for David in place of Kristen. From beginning to end, it was all a hallucination Kristen had experienced. Confused between reality and illusion, Kristen once again looked at her shoelaces. Once she confirmed she was in reality, she hurriedly sought the psychologist and relayed her hallucination. The psychologist told Kristen that it was merely due to her guilt, and reminded her that during her husband's 2-month absence, she often mentioned David instead of Andy, symbolizing work over family. She was then asked to consider who she should choose. When Kristen told the psychologist that David wanted to become a priest and they couldn't be together, the psychologist suggested a mischievous plan to ruin David's path to priesthood. The next day, David participated in the test but didn't see anything. That night, he shared the test results with the nun and mentioned that he could no longer connect with God through meditation, possibly because of the experiment. Hearing this, the nun warned David not to attempt to change his brain using technology. She advised him to start rebuilding his connection with God and to do it quickly, as Townsend was already making moves. Only David's abilities could protect them now. Early the next morning, David and the others submitted their evaluation reports. David thought it was best to abandon the experiment, stating that faith should not be changed through machines. But the bishop believed it could be used to strengthen their followers. Kristen suggested they continue using the device since it could treat mental disorders. Ben, on the other hand, remained neutral. Seeing the trio's differing opinions, the bishop asked them to hand over their reports for thorough consideration. Back in his room, David followed the nun's instructions and tried to re-establish his connection with God. Meanwhile, Andy found Kristen taking a bath and wanted to have a serious discussion about their family's future plans. Andy planned to switch to a more stable job and suggested Kristen quit her job at the church. He also proposed that Kristen's mother move out. Seeing Kristen's disagreement, Andy told her that he noticed she had changed, and he was certain it's because of her job. She even bit up a man rudely on the street, and now they needed to wear hoods during their intimacy. Hearing this, Kristen responded seriously, saying that her church job allowed her to support herself and their daughter. Not wanting to argue, Andy then pulled out a notebook he found while organizing masks. Kristen quickly grabbed it and explained to him that the roots in the notebook weren't murder roots, but a form of therapy for her to release her anger. Seeing Kristen crying in fear that their daughter might think she's a murderer, Andy could only comfort her. In the middle of the night, unable to sleep, Kristen went to the kitchen. Using a red-hot crucifix necklace, she burned a new mark onto her stomach. This was possibly driven by her guilt towards her murder. In the early morning, the fighter pilot, Captain Cassie, sought help from the church, claiming that she encountered a glowing object while flying her jet. She felt it was like an angel or perhaps a drone. Although uncertain of what it was, she felt a step closer to God. The trio who met her were told by the bishop that the church had been paying attention to UFO sightings reported by church residents since the 80s. So the mission for them this time was to assess the credibility of Cassie's story. After leaving the church, Kristen sought her psychologist with her husband Andy. At this point, Ben also called Kristen, telling her that he had just found an online post claiming to have seen a UFO. The sighting happened on the same day Cassie saw the UFO. He asked Kristen to accompany him the following day, but Kristen informed him that she had already scheduled a meeting with Cassie's superior officer. After the call, Kristen and her husband began their psychological consultation. Kristen said the burn on her stomach was due to her carelessness and insisted she hadn't changed at all, and that her work in the church had taught her how to actively respond to threats. She also expressed that she wanted her daughters to follow this approach. At home, Kristen's mother showed her granddaughters a video of Kristen beating up the man. Seeing the trending video, her daughters immediately saw Kristen as a superhero. The next day, Cassie's superior officer told Kristen that what Cassie saw was not a UFO, but a communication satellite launched by a transport company. 2 accompanying pilots could also testify to this. In the end, there were no UFOs, only spacecraft launched or new inventions. On the other hand, Ben, who had arrived at the university as planned, met the internet girl who made the post. The girl's description was exactly the same as what Cassie saw, and he felt blissful when the light passed through him. However, before leaving, the internet girl told Ben that he had taken some pills that night, so he wasn't sure if it was a hallucination. Back at the church, Kristen and Ben reported their investigation results to the bishop, who decided to leave this case to the church. Back in his room, David continued trying to connect with God, but was interrupted by the sudden arrival of Townsend. As soon as he entered the room, Townsend knelt down crying, begging David to take back his sacred items, claiming that he was attacked by a winged monster while sleeping. He then drew a picture of the creature, but David threw him out of the room because what he drew was the Archangel Michael. David then sought out Ben to look at the surveillance footage before Townsend came to find him. Seeing Townsend sleeping on the couch, David believed that he was putting on a show. After all, who sleeps with their computer facing them? Upon returning home, Kristen and her husband initiated a family meeting with their daughters. Kristen advised her daughters not to follow her example, explaining that beating up a man was an overreaction. Andy added that he would travel to another state for a month, during which he would close his trekking business. When he returned, he planned to find a new job to spend more time with his family. Meanwhile, David upgraded his equipment in his pursuit to meet God. He brought out a portrait and started playing a meditative hymn on his computer. After lowering the volume, David began to see visions, but they were all negative. When he returned to reality, he noticed a buzzing sound coming from his computer. The next morning, David and his companions questioned the 2 pilots who had flown with Cassie. The bald man told them that he hadn't seen anything, and the younger man, after some hesitation, agreed with the bald man's claim. Sensing that the younger man was holding back something, Ben discreetly handed him his email address as he was leaving, mentioning that his father used to be a mechanic in the Air Force, hinting at his understanding of the situation. Watching the 2 men leave, David took out his laptop, hoping Ben could help inspect it. Upon opening the laptop, they discovered that someone had indeed tampered with it. At that moment, Ben received an anonymous email. Upon opening it, he found a video of a UFO sighting. Due to the video, the church attracted a group of influential people the next day. To understand the situation better, a priest from the Pontifical Academy came to assess Cassie. He also had Cassie smell different scents from a device. Shortly, Cassie identified a particular scent, the same one she smelled when she spotted the UFO. After finishing the assessment, the priest told the trio that he wanted to speak with the internet girl who posted online claiming to have witnessed the UFO. He also admitted that the Vatican had been filtering through UFO sighting reports they'd received. If extraterrestrial life truly exists, the church was willing to share God's gospel with them. Later, Ben told David his computer had likely been tampered with and that he didn't need to replace it. Those masterminds seemed to enjoy watching his private life, so he suggested giving them a continuous loop. Kristen rushed home, but encountered a person who claimed to be a government worker. He had asked her and her team to abandon their investigation into the UFO and stated that the government had no plans to make this issue public. She shared it with the team later. With no permission to continue their investigation, Ben decided to leave. Kristen started a conversation with David. She expressed her belief that there was no such thing as innate human goodness, let alone the concept of doing good deeds. Seeing David's silence, she changed the subject and asked him why he wanted to become a priest. David confided that his decision was related to his late girlfriend. He also admitted that humans can be wicked, often unwilling to apologize after doing wrong, as they view it as a sign of weakness. Preparing to leave, Kristen advised David not to become a priest. When asked for a reason, she simply replied that she would miss him. Perhaps it was the conversation with David, but upon returning home, Kristen apologized to Andy for her recent changes. The next morning, the trio arrived at the church and found Cassie and the internet girl waiting in the hallway. After exchanging brief greetings, they were called over by the bishop. They entered the meeting room to find a man sent by the church from Rome. He confirmed to Kristen that the person who had visited her the previous day was indeed from the National Security Bureau. However, he hadn't been truthful about the UFO. His main purpose for coming was to invite them to Rome for further assessment. He then produced a confidentiality agreement. As David signed it, he saw promotional materials for the RSM fertility in the briefcase that the man had deliberately left open. To David's query, the man advised him to focus on the task at hand. Before long, David rushed into the meeting room, questioning the man about the cancellation of the trip. The man informed him that since Cassie and the internet girl had just admitted to lying, they had to drop the matter. He also advised David to give up on investigating RSM fertility. Knowing that Rome was also investigating, David left the room laughing. Clearly, the government had begun intervening. As a condition, Cassie was granted the opportunity to continue piloting fighter jets, while the internet girl was given a chance to study at MIT. Because of the government's involvement, the trio had to drop their investigation and turn to drinking to drown their sorrows. A tipsy Kristen recounted her own encounter with a UFO during a mountaineering trip. Using borrowed equipment, the trio finally discovered the scent reported by UFO witnesses, the smell of cotton candy. Seeing David wanting to bypass the church and investigate the nursery on his own, Kristen and Ben decided to help him to the end. The scene then shifts to Townsend, who has managed to dodge surveillance and is now in his office, subject to an assessment by the Horned Demon. The Horned Demon suspects that Townsend is trying to use the exorcism as a ruse to make a real break from the demons. Upon hearing that the demon is preparing to report his findings to the authorities, Townsend retorts that he is merely following the plan and that the exorcism was a hoax from the start, so he should not be under suspicion. However, he points out that although Townsend claims loyalty to the demons, he has not seen him submit any blood. As Townsend storms out in rage, the Horned Demon reminds him that another assessment will take place in a few days and to remember to bring his dream journal. Reluctantly, Townsend seeks out Kristen's mother, who is in the middle of a ritual, hoping she can provide him with some blood to fulfill his obligation. After telling Townsend she would consider it, she sends him away. Soon, Townsend faces his second assessment. The Horned Demon starts by mocking Townsend for having to resort to buying pig's blood to fulfill his obligation. Unexpectedly, Townsend retaliates by chopping off the demon's lamb head, declaring that he was the boss here. During dinner, Kristen's mother approaches Townsend, agreeing to provide him with her blood. However, Townsend says he has already sorted it out. He also invites her to join him for dinner and discuss some business matters. After asking her to wait, Townsend returns to the kitchen to continue preparing dinner, and a lamb leg conspicuously appears in a pot. Kristen's mother enjoys a lamb feast, symbolizing a formal reconciliation with Townsend. Townsend even invites Kristen's mother to join him at the party. Then the two toast to their common enemy. Due to their private investigation into the fertility clinic, the trio meets at the church early in the morning. Kristen tells the other two that she believes it's just a normal medical procedure with no irregularities. However, when her second daughter, Lexis, is mentioned, Kristen becomes defensive. To ease the tension, David suggests asking Matilda's biological mother. Soon, the mother is invited to the church and shares the same opinion as Kristen, that it was just a regular medical checkup. The only difference was that 4 years ago, she received a bill for the egg storage from the fertility clinic. As for her daughter Matilda, there were no major issues, only that she had had a surgery to correct 2 pointed teeth. As a reminder, Lexis, who was also born from the RSM fertility, also grew some strange teeth. In the evening, Lexis in the bathroom starts whitening her teeth, following a video from the beauty influencer. Back in her room, Lexis seems unusually quiet, which worries Kristen. When Kristen enters the dining room, she sees Lexis having a second helping. After being stopped, Lexis asks about her appearance. The camera focuses on Kristen as she compliments Lexis, but her eyes are looking at Lexis's nose, indicating that she was possibly lying. Later on, Kristen placed a call to inquire about the egg storage fees, but was informed by the manager that someone had already paid all the fees annually. But according to company policy, they couldn't disclose who the payer was. Hanging up the phone, Kristen was left utterly confused. Early the next day, Kristen hurried to the fertility clinic, hoping to find out who was paying her fees. At first, regardless of Kristen's requests, the receptionist was unwilling to help. But finally, she discreetly told Kristen that a doctor named Kara had been paying the fees. However, this person had resigned 5 years ago. As Kristen left, the receptionist cryptically muttered something about the end of the world being imminent and that a countdown had begun. At this point, Kristen received a call from Ben, asking if she could conduct a psychological evaluation for Vanessa. The backstory of all this began after Ben left the church and went to find Vanessa. Upon entering the house, Vanessa informed him that the mess in the house was all due to the spirit of her younger sister possessing her right hand. Seeing Vanessa's breakdown, Ben suggested introducing her to Kristen for a chat. However, Vanessa told Ben she had a better plan. Her plan was to take Ben to a spirit medium, hoping she could help exorcise her sister's spirit. Vanessa agreed with Ben that if the spirit medium couldn't help, she would go to Kristen. The ritual then began with the spirit medium. As the medium chanted, a gust of wind blew through the room. Guided by the medium, Vanessa told her sister's spirit that she wanted to start a new life. However, the table suddenly flipped over, and the medium ordered the spirit to stop bothering Vanessa. After everything calmed down, Vanessa suddenly screamed and fainted. Back in the present, Ben, on the call with Kristen, was pulled into the house by an enthusiastic Vanessa. After everything was over, Ben suggested Vanessa should still talk with Kristen. Unwilling to go, Vanessa raised her left hand and told Ben that her sister's spirit had already left. However, Ben asked if she hadn't said before that the spirit was in her right hand. Why had it moved to her left hand? Vanessa seemed to have planned something no good, but she changed the subject abruptly. Back at the church, Kristen and David saw another old woman. Like Matilda's biological mother, both believed everything was normal. However, when they mentioned the attending physician, she told them that her doctor had also been Dr. Kara. She then gave them Dr. Kara's contact information. Because Kristen was going to attend Townsend's party and wanted to buy some clothes for her daughters on the way, she once again saw Lexis looking unhappy in front of the mirror. At that moment, Kristen's mother walked out dressed in a red gown and received high praise. She went back to the fitting room and started a spree of zero-cost buying. Seeing Lexis still not coming out after a long time, Kristen went to find her and discovered Lexis was using a beauty filter camera. Kristen asked her mother if she knew about Lexis's excessive focus on her appearance, but her mother said that this behavior was normal for teenage girls. Lexis returned home and looked into the mirror. To her surprise, she saw a tail attached to her reflection. This seemed to explain the root cause of her gloom. Afterward, Kristen found Dr. Kara. In response to Kristen's queries, the doctor explained that her actions were driven by religious beliefs, and she considered every egg as potential life, which is why she often funded the storage. However, Kristen disagreed with the doctor's approach, viewing it as an invasion of privacy, and prepared to sue the doctor for a medical mishap. This led to a heated argument between the two. Immediately after Kristen left, the doctor herself departed in her car. At this time, David, who had been waiting outside, decided to follow. The surveillance led to an unexpected discovery. The doctor had visited Townsend's apartment alone. David relayed this information to Kristen. After hanging up the call, Kristen was worried about Lexis and went to see her. After ensuring Lexis was physically well and not disturbing her homework, Kristen left the room. But watching her mother leave, Lexis opened her laptop and continued to watch the beauty influencer's weight loss videos. Since they knew Dr. Kara was in contact with Townsend, David and his team once again sought out the doctor, hoping to continue the previous day's conversation. However, they were informed at the reception that Dr. Kara had called in the morning to say she was taking a long leave. Later, Ben went to visit Vanessa's house again. The two engaged in a long but smelly hormone yoga session. However, Ben was surprised to see a call from Vanessa, who informed him that her train had been delayed and she was on her way home. Ben was completely panicked, realizing that the person in front of him was not Vanessa, but her sister, who was a ghost. Ben quickly pulled up his fishy pants and left Vanessa's house. In order to retrieve her stored eggs, Kristen brought her court notice to the fertility clinic. But she was told by the reception that they only had a record of 11 eggs, not the 12 that Kristen mentioned. When Kristen inquired further, the receptionist simply responded with a professional smile. Meanwhile, David, who was tracking Dr. Kara, noticed that her car had been parked in the same place since yesterday. He decided to inquire with Townsend, but ran into Kristen's mother and a man named Edward coming out of the house. After a brief greeting, Edward informed David that Dr. Kara had visited last night but had left Townsend's house quickly. After saying this, he and Kristen's mother merrily left the apartment. The reason Kristen's mother was coming out of the house with Edward begins with Townsend's party. Kristen's mother, dressed in a sexy dress, realized she had been tricked by Townsend again. The party was clearly a white-themed event. In response to her complaints, Townsend comforted her, saying that she was the brightest person in the room. Townsend added that life should be full of surprises and shocks. On the second floor, Townsend introduced Kristen's mother to Edward. They got along well and even exchanged phone numbers, but not hormones yet. A few days later, Kristen's mother was invited to meet with Edward again. After drinking Edward's custom-made cocktail, she curiously asked why he had invited her. Edward kept her in suspense. While receiving a foot massage, Kristen's mother continued to wonder about the surprise Edward had mentioned, but he remained silent. When the time was right, and after making sure Kristen's mother couldn't stand, Edward took out a syringe. He told Kristen's mother that they were in this together and started injecting her. At this moment, Townsend entered the room. After ensuring Kristen's mother was comfortable, he went to another room where another person was lying. It's Dr. Kara, who was also under control of Townsend. After telling the doctor that everything was fine, Townsend took out a vial of liquid and started to inject both of them. On the other hand, Kristen returned home from the fertility clinic and found Lexis caring for her skin. She then showed her the beauty influencer's bare face photo from the internet and told her daughter that nobody was perfect. Everyone has minor flaws, and these imperfections make us unique. Lexis returned to her room, looked at the tail in the mirror, and began to play with it joyfully. Kristen's mother, who was injected with an unknown liquid by Townsend, started to enjoy the benefits. She felt rejuvenated and began to rely on the liquid. However, Townsend, a member of the Devil's 60 group, observed all of this. Over at the church, the agent from the Internal Revenue Service approached them, hoping they could help investigate a newly established religious group called the New Church of Satan. She wanted to determine whether the organization met the tax exemption criteria. The trio then visited the organization. Upon learning that they were sent by the IRS, the organization's founder, Graham, told them that he prayed 3 times daily. As a reward, Satan granted him his desires. He then led the 3 to their place of worship. Looking at a young man filling out orders, Ben and Kristen struck up a conversation with him. They learned that all the t-shirts hanging on the wall sold for $35 each, while their cost was just $6. The staggering profit margin shocked Ben and Kristen. At the place of worship, Graham introduced their object of worship to David's group. He also told them that he had studied IRS documents in depth to achieve tax exemption. As for prayer times, they were set for Friday evenings, and the group had grown to 12 members. He then brought out promotional materials. Listening to the prayer words from him, Kristen pointed out that it was a scam. After leaving, Ben agreed with Kristen, saying that this organization was just a wolf in sheep's clothing. Back at the church, David eavesdropped on the conversation between an exorcist and Townsend. The exorcist told Townsend that the final stage of the exorcism ceremony would last 3 nights, and once started, it couldn't be stopped. It could potentially be life-threatening, so a liability waiver would be needed. After looking at the promotional materials brought by David, Townsend asked the exorcist to leave temporarily. Townsend questioned David that he had never seen a Satan-worshipping church that uses family picnic photos in their promotional materials. He believed that the followers of Satan believe in power, manipulation, and violence. These blasphemers should be captured and offered as blood sacrifices. David pondered over his remarks. Elsewhere, Kristen and her husband once again sought out her psychologist and began practicing mirror exercises. Andy suddenly asked her if she had ever cheated on him. Despite Kristen's negative response, an unconvinced Andy asked directly if she had ever been intimate with David. As a vision of the creepy demon appeared, Kristen skillfully steered the conversation towards trust in a marriage. The psychologist deemed this as a successful discussion. After allowing Andy to leave momentarily, Kristen revealed to the psychologist that she had another hallucination, and it seemed to be getting worse. The doctor promptly prescribed 2 new medications for Kristen. In the evening, Townsend began the 3-day exorcism ritual. Unlike previous times, Townsend was covered in sweat and writhing in pain, his voice changing, begging the exorcist to stop the ritual. David helped the priest to control Townsend, who kicked the priest away in agony. After the ritual, David asked the exorcist if Townsend was acting, only to be told that if he was, he deserved an Oscar for his performance. Meanwhile, Townsend lay in bed, his hands shaking. The next day, David invited Kristen to attend Townsend's exorcism ritual in the evening and recounted the previous night's events. He believed that this time it might be God intervening to deal with Townsend. Ben then arrived and informed the bishop that Graham was a shrewd businessman who tripled his business performance in just a year. They just needed to report this information to the IRS. However, the bishop played a recording and instructed the trio to revisit the organization to investigate Bishop Jim, who sounded extremely devout in the recording. Upon arriving at the organization, they saw Bishop Jim conducting a ceremony. When Graham interrupted, Jim explained that it was just a rehearsal. He also noticed the St. Christopher pendant that David was wearing, which led to a heated debate. Kristen, noticing that Graham had no interest in the religious dispute, approached him. Graham confided in Kristen that he understood the IRS's perspective, but genuinely worshipped Satan, who allowed people to confront their true nature and desires. He encouraged her to join them. Kristen, however, advised him to get a real job. Kristen took the new medication prescribed by her psychologist before rushing to attend Townsend's exorcism ritual. As the exorcist recited prayers, Townsend began changing personalities and screamed in pain. Suddenly, he vomited a pool of black liquid. Seeing the liquid, Kristen felt unwell. She rushed to the bathroom and started hallucinating. She found blood on her stomach and upon lifting her shirt saw a monstrous fetus crawling out from her belly. Back in her car, Kristen confirmed it was just a hallucination and headed to a bar to calm her nerves. There, however, she bumped into Graham, who readily admitted to somewhat stalking her, and also clarified to Kristen that he indeed wasn't a faithful believer. After hearing this, Kristen downed a drink and let loose, engaging in some car fun with Graham. After their fishy moment, Kristen headed home and changed her fishy underwear. But she was discovered by her mother, who suggested that she should take a bath and shower to clean the fishy smell, reminding her to dispose of her clothes into a garbage bag, which she would help her throw away the next day. Seeing Kristen attempt to argue, her mother continued, saying she had been through this before and that was how she met Kristen's father. Just then, Townsend called Kristen's mother for help. She then arrived at Townsend's house to find him huddled in a corner, shivering. She then started preparing a bloodbath for him. After handing Townsend a soda, she poured 2 bottles of blood that she had just taken from the room all over his head. Seeing Townsend regain his strength, Kristen's mother bid him farewell. Kristen followed her mother's advice and took a thorough shower. After finishing everything, she returned to her room to sleep. However, just a few minutes after lying down, she felt as if she hadn't cleaned herself properly and went back to the bathroom. There, she noticed a stain on the bathtub and started scrubbing it away. The next morning, Kristen rushed to tell her psychologist that she had another hallucination and asked to stop taking her medication. Seeing him reluctant to do so, Kristen blurted out, suspecting of sleeping with her mom, who told him to do so. The psychologist suggested that they sit down and talk properly, but Kristen snapped back, saying there was no need for talk and stormed out. Just then, the psychologist's wife called. Before she could say much, an irate Kristen accused her of spying and hung up. After regaining her composure, Kristen joined David to submit their analysis report to the IRS agent. They added that the organization had started selling t-shirts even before applying for tax exemption, and all the profits had gone into Graham's pocket, indicating that the organization should not be tax exempt. However, the IRS agent informed them that Graham and Bishop Jim had raised objections, so she wanted them to provide some reasonable explanations. Upon meeting, Graham informed everyone that he had slept with Kristen the previous night, indicating that her opinion might be biased. Seeing the surprised faces around her, Kristen just laughed and denied Graham's accusations. Hearing Kristen willing to swear on the Bible once again, the IRS agent dismissed Graham and Jim's objections. Before leaving, Bishop Jim threatened the group that Satan would come for them. In the evening, Townsend began his final exorcism ceremony. Due to being immersed in blood, he once again returned to his dramatic self. However, Kristen began to struggle in pain in the bathroom. When the priest asked Townsend if he was willing to sever all ties with the devil, Kristen painfully said she was willing at the same time. This series of odd events happening on Kristen, including the killing of Orson, beating up an innocent man in the supermarket, and being obsessed with dating new guys, all indicates that she might have been possessed from the very beginning. After the ceremony, David, who came out, found Kristen and asked if she was influenced by the exorcism and planning to resign and find a new job. However, Kristen told David that she had no plans to change jobs, and also asked him if exorcism would work when someone did not believe in God. David believed that God is always with them regardless of individual choices, but Kristen thought this was just a form of comfort. She suddenly remembered that her husband was going to leave home for a month in 10 minutes, so she rushed back home and left a voice message for Andy on the way. She apologized for blaming him due to her mental instability and realized that only he and their daughters mattered the most to her. When Kristen got home, she only saw a neatly made double bed. Then through the window, she saw a fire in her backyard. It turned out that Andy had changed his flight after receiving Kristen's message. Seeing Kristen's curiosity about the fire basin, Andy explained it was a fire offering ceremony in Tibetan Buddhism and showed her how the ritual should be completed for an exorcism. Under his guidance, Kristen completed the fire offering ceremony. On the other side, Townsend saw an evil spirit while sleeping. However, he did not show any signs of panic, but greeted the other party with a smile. After the exorcism, Townsend found the priest in charge, hoping to become a free psychotherapist in the church. To prevent Townsend from succeeding, the old nun started to interrupt their conversation from time to time. Unable to stand it, the priest had to temporarily ask the annoying nun to leave the office. Later, the nun came to David to help him prepare for the priest's assessment. During this time, David showed signs of wavering, feeling that he would become a lonely person without children after becoming a priest. Seeing David waver, the nun said that both of them have talents and are believers chosen by God. If he wavered now, it was Townsend's scheme. The war has begun. As expected, the nun was told by the priest in charge that the church had decided to let Townsend become a legal consultant, and from then on, all the reports from the three must be signed by Townsend. It seems that his real purpose is not to stop David from taking tasks from the church, but as a member of the Devil's 60 group, to infiltrate and manipulate the church. On the other side, Kristen, having successfully undergone the exorcism, voluntarily sought out her psychologist. She apologized for her previous irrational accusations and agreed to resume psychological treatment from next week. Kristen, who was ecstatic about not having hallucinations for 4 consecutive days, was asked by the psychologist to talk to one of his patients, Nathan. Nathan revealed to Kristen that his wife passed away from a heart condition a year ago, but strange occurrences began to happen in his house a month ago. He would occasionally see the shadow of a man in reflections in his house, like in mirrors or windows. What was worse, not long after this shadow began to haunt his son, the boy had a fall and broke his arm. After hearing this, Kristen relayed the information to David. Since the shadow only seemed to be active at night, they agreed to visit Nathan's house in the evening. Meanwhile, David hung up his phone and met with a pastor he had met at a previous gathering. After a brief introduction to the special church he created, which seemed like a community service center, the pastor started to sway David by saying that they will never allow an African American to become the Pope in Italy. He invited David to join their church where there are no restrictions, and he would guarantee David could fully utilize his abilities here. In the evening, the psychologist, who intended to write a book about the experiences of David and his colleagues, also joined them for the exorcism evaluation. Nathan told David that according to his son, it felt as if someone pushed him when he fell. At that moment, David noticed some liquid on the ceiling. Upon learning that it was from the attic, the three of them went there to investigate and found a box. Inside the box was a doll. Nathan explained to them that his wife bought this doll from a flea market 10 years ago. The shopkeeper who sold the doll had warned his wife to take good care of it or else face retaliation. Ben, who was skeptical, decided to bring the doll home temporarily for further examination. Meanwhile, Kristen's eldest daughter, Lynn, started working part-time as a babysitter. When her parents left, Lynn asked the kid what games he wanted to play. However, she was told that a friend of his gets to decide what games they play. But Lynn suggested they play hide and seek. After counting to 10, she found the kid sitting on the bed, motionless. Following his gaze, Lynn discovered that the friend he was talking about was actually a doll. When Lynn returned home, she found the same doll in her backpack. Later, the parents of the child who lost the doll came over and asked if Lynn had taken it, as it was their son's favorite toy. Kristen, hearing that her daughter was accused of being a thief, told them that Lynn was already asleep and that they would discuss the matter over the phone later. When Lynn heard the questioning, she told her mother that the doll was indeed in her bag, but she was sure she didn't steal it. She guessed that the kid might have been scared and put it in her bag deliberately. Kristen then told Lynn to return the doll first before discussing further. However, when Lynn went back to her room, she found that the doll was no longer in her bag. She then blamed her sisters, and after a family argument, Kristen asked everyone to help look for the missing doll. At the church, David once again sought out the old nun, asking her if she ever regretted becoming a nun. The nun assured him that she had no regrets, as she knew the meaning of her life. Moreover, she said they were about to face a war at a higher level, and this was also the reason he was alive. She also reminded David that both God and the devil are always by his side. In the morning, David sought out the pastor again, asking why he left the church he served before. The pastor told David that he didn't leave the church, but simply left his parish. However, that didn't mean he stopped serving God. On the contrary, in the church he founded, he can do many things that the church does not allow. He continued to persuade David to join him. When David refused on the grounds of exorcism, the pastor asked if David still believed in those myths and ghost stories in these modern days. To this man, all those exorcists in the church were just putting on a show. At that moment, David received a text message. Arriving at Nathan's house, David was informed that he thought giving away the doll would solve the problem, but the shadow appeared again last night. Affected by the shadow, it felt like insects were crawling on his arm, and his son took a chainsaw. Ben turned off the room lights and told everyone that he detected a toxic substance on the surface of the doll. This substance can appear under ultraviolet light. Upon shining the light, they discovered many demonic sigils. In the early morning, the three were called into the office to explain the sigils. Kristen suggested that Nathan and his son might have a panic disorder. As for the demonic sigils on the wall, Ben explained that it might be due to Halloween decorations that the family had once hung on the wall, plus the thermal bridge effect, causing the appearance of the sigils. Not quite agreeing with the scientific explanation, the priest in charge, upon hearing David's belief in demonic assault, decided to send someone else to handle the matter. Upon entering the room, the man taking the task told Nathan to be honest, and if his issues caused the exorcism to fail, he would not take responsibility. He then began the exorcism. Observing the extravagant performance, the psychologist started recording but was stopped by Kristen. After all, the over-the-top acting and dialogue would only make people think it was a sham. The psychologist, after leaving the room, played back the recording. At this moment, the psychologist saw the same demon who used to haunt Kristen in her nightmare but was killed by her. The demon, seeing the flustered psychologist, tapped his nose. At that moment, Kristen's shout brought the psychologist back to reality. With her reminder, the psychologist touched his nose, which scared him quite a bit. Meanwhile, the awakened Lexus discovered that her younger sister had secretly hidden the doll. Thinking it's their grandmother's doll, Lexus snatched the doll and ran to find his grandmother, only to find that she was not at home. After placing the doll on the altar, Lexus tried to pray like her grandmother, but was stopped by her sister. Just then, a train passed by. Along with the vibrations and the sound of the train's horn, the two kids were frightened and ran back into their room. The next day, Nathan sought out David, hoping to retrieve the doll, because even after the exorcism was completed, he still saw the shadow and he had lied about the truth. Ever since Nathan's wife and son had bought the doll, they had been worshipping it until Nathan put a stop to it. However, once they stopped, disaster struck. A month after they stopped worshipping the doll, Nathan's wife died of heart disease. Seeing Nathan's resolute attitude, David didn't know what to say. After sending Nathan away, David told Kristen he was having doubts about whether or not to become a priest. Seeing David's hesitation, Kristen encouraged him, saying that they had gone through a lot in the past year. Even though they had different views, she enjoyed the time they spent together. David asked a question that had been on his mind for a long time. If they had met earlier, would they have already fallen in love? Kristen admitted and told David to accept his holy orders. Early in the morning, Edward found Kristen's mother, who was on her way to drop her granddaughter off at school, and asked her to join him in a game. He also promised that once she helped him with 2 tasks, there would be a big reward. Afterwards, she and Edward prepared to attend a business meeting. At this time, Edward handed her a pair of sunglasses and a jigsaw puzzle he had prepared earlier. He told her not to worry about anything during the meeting and just focus on her puzzle. When he said daffodil, she was to go up and slap someone. At the meeting, Kristen's mother did as agreed and slapped the person. This shows daffodil is used as the trigger word to manipulate others to take specific actions. That night, Kristen's mother was having dinner with Edward. After hearing the word daffodil, she went to the nearby table and, in front of everyone, pulled out a report on sexually transmitted diseases, humiliating the victim on the spot. The next morning, Edward presented the big gift he had promised to her. It's the head of his great-grandfather. Edward also congratulated her on her graduation and announced that she was now his successor, and this was her sigil. Back in her room, Kristen's mother indeed found the corresponding sigil on the chart. At this moment, she also saw the doll that Lexus had placed on the altar. She placed Edward's gift and the dolls in the order of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit to represent the Holy Trinity of Christianity, and then said, "Please enjoy me." This indicated that Kristen's mother had been converted into a member of the Devil's 60 group. The scene then shifts to David facing his examination to become a priest. David was well prepared, and these tests seemed pretty simple to him. After confirming that David wasn't entangled in financial disputes and had completely kicked his sex addiction, the examiner let him officially pass the examination. However, on his way out, explicit sexual imagery suddenly popped into his mind. After the examination, David went to the medical school for a new mission with his team. After a brief introduction, the student, Mitch, told the 3 of them that he had been a vegetarian since his teens. However, at a family gathering a few weeks ago, he found himself eating an entire steak raw. Initially, he thought it was a normal bodily reaction, needing enzymes, but now his condition has escalated. He salivated at the sight of a corpse during his anatomy class. Moreover, ever since he smelled formaldehyde and the stench of decaying flesh in class, he often dreamed of being in the mental hospital behind the academic building, where he was constantly chased by a demon in his dreams. Upon arriving at the mental hospital, Ben began the examination, reminding David to come to the bachelor party they had prepared for him that evening. At this moment, David noticed bloodstains on the ground. Following the trail, they saw the slogan, "Haunted at 3 a.m. on the wall. Since the haunting time was 3 a.m., David decided to attend his bachelor party at Ben's house. At the party, the psychologist asked the old nun about the demon he had seen at Nathan's house. The nun taunted him that he now turned to the church for help because science couldn't explain it. She also told him if he was serious, go find the priest and have him perform an exorcism for him. If he didn't follow this, the demon he had seen would drag him to hell after he died. At this moment, Kristen's mother told the priest in charge that she knew her daughter didn't like Townsend, but she believed that after they worked together for a while, their relationship would surely improve. On the other side, Kristen played with her daughters. At this moment, Lexus asked her mother where she had been and why he could smell the stench of a corpse. Faced with Lexus's question, Kristen was baffled. After the party, the trio went to the mental hospital. Seeing Kristen sniffing around, Ben became curious, but he couldn't smell anything. As they were investigating, they heard a strange noise. Following the noise, they arrived at the dissection room and saw red liquid on the dissection table. David began to check it out, only to find that it wasn't blood, but red wine. At this moment, Kristen saw the refrigerator behind slowly opening. After a scream, the other refrigerators also opened one after another. It turned out that a few curious students had come here to play a ghost-catching game. Kristen complained to Ben about these naughty kids, always looking for trouble. She said she would write a report and hand it to the school, but when she turned around, she found out that the person following wasn't David. At this point, David had accidentally ended up in the lecture hall while helping the students close the door. There, he saw a demon gnawing at a corpse. Terrified, David ran away. He met Kristen and Ben, but when he went to confirm further, he found nothing. The next morning, David told the old nun about the demon he had seen and that the demon didn't seem like an illusion. The nun said he is chosen by God and God allows us to see the truth. The closer we are to God, the more tangible the good and evil we see. She then revealed the scars on her arm, but David was unable to accept this, saying that why life had to be so crazy. He just wanted to live a peaceful life. The nun told him that life is indeed crazy. On the other side, Kristen also found her psychologist and began smelling her hair. After confirming that there was no unusual smell, Kristen asked him if she had contracted Cotard's syndrome and if it was related to her work. However, the psychologist did not provide any treatment suggestions. Instead, he told Kristen that he was planning to take a 2-month vacation on his wife's advice and would refer Kristen to another doctor during his leave. As for the smell Kristen mentioned, he personally believed that Kristen had not completely moved on from the incident with the serial killer Orson. He also promised to return in no more than 2 months. In the evening, the priest in charge summoned David. It turns out that David had submitted an exorcism application to the church during the day, hoping to preside over the exorcism ceremony himself. At the same time, Ben also received a phone call from Mitch's roommate. Upon learning that Mitch had bitten through his restraints and headed to the mental hospital, David and Ben rushed over immediately. Following the sounds, they saw Mitch trying to eat a corpse's arm raw while simultaneously crying out in protest. After pulling Mitch away, Ben noticed the demonic symbol on the scalp of the corpse. Meanwhile, the old nun, who was fast asleep, also saw the demon. The demon started speaking in a demonic language. Not wanting to engage with the demon, she broke free from her restraints and stabbed a nearby cross into the demon's body. She also warned the fleeing demon not to harm David. Upon waking up, the nun immediately took note of everything the demon had said to her. Early in the morning, Kristen began Mitch's psychological assessment. The terrified Mitch claimed that he didn't know the corpse at all, let alone the demonic symbol on its scalp. At that moment, Townsend also sought them out, intending to join the investigation. But Kristen pulled him out of the bedroom and called David. Townsend also called the priest and complained about Kristen not cooperating at work and lying about her using violence to hit him. Hearing this, the priest in charge summoned Kristen back. However, before leaving, Kristen helped Townsend fulfill his lie. She took off her high heels, giving him a few good strikes to the head. After she left, Townsend began brainwashing Mitch. He argued that there were no legal prohibitions against eating the dead raw, pointing to the Catholic Church's rituals of consuming the body and blood of Christ as a precedent. He claimed that we were merely imitating their sacraments. In the evening, Mitch found Townsend. As soon as he entered the room, he saw everyone welcoming him. After exchanging greetings, a bewildered Mitch was led by the crowd to the corpse. Under the witness of everyone, Mitch ate the demonic symbol. At the church, the nun and David began examining the symbol. With David's reminders, the nun successfully translated everything the demon had said to her the previous night. It turns out the 60 devil sigils on the paper corresponded to 60 families who worshipped the demon, dating back as far as 600 years. Each family's patriarch, before dying, would have their successor eat them. The next day, David's inauguration ceremony took place. However, during the prayer, images of sexual activity once again filled his mind. Meanwhile, Kristen saw Townsend hand a note to her daughter. When Lexis opened it, she saw the word daffodil. Kristen became flustered and quickly called Lexis outside. She then learned that Townsend had been going to the school to chat with Lexis. This information left Kristen taken aback. When Kristen returned home, she let her daughters have some free time. Back in their room, the girls started discussing a television show. However, Lexis pulled out the pop-up book from the bookshelf and began to read on her bed. When Lexis turned to the last page, she saw the word daffodil once again. At the same time, downstairs, Kristen's gaze fell on the storage room. After some consideration, Kristen took the ice pick and went outside, intending for something no good. David was drinking alone in his room and heard a knock on the door. It turns out it was Kristen. Kristen told David that earlier, upon learning that Townsend had been deliberately interacting with her daughter, she had planned to kill Townsend with the ice pick. However, she calmed down and decided to confess to David. Guided by David, Kristen confessed to killing Orson in tears. Seeing the guilt-ridden Kristen, David forgave her on behalf of God. After receiving forgiveness, Kristen finally let go of the emotions she had been suppressing and began wrestling her tongue with David. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.